So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to join us for a fascinating conversation between two great writers and thinkers, brought to you from the Upstart and Crow Literary Arts Studio here on Granville Island in Vancouver. My name is Ian Gill, and I'm co-founder with my partner Zoe Grams of Upstart and Crow, where we are the guests on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Upstart and Crow is proud to partner with the Tyee and with the Salmon Nation Festival of What Works to bring to you another in a series of special events about ideas that matter. Tonight, your host is the remarkable Dorothy Woodend, who I'm fortunate enough to call a colleague thanks to my role as a contributing editor of the Tyee and hers as its culture editor. Dorothy has won more writing awards than I've had hot dinners, and it's in her good hands that we're going to be introduced to another brilliant local writer, J.B. McKinnon, author of this great new book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping. So over to Dorothy to give J.B. a proper introduction with one last thought from me. You're going to hear a lot tonight about why we need to stop shopping, but I have a caveat, which is that it's okay to buy this book. Just make sure you buy it from an independent bookstore. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Dorothy, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and thank you for joining us. And it's just a huge honor for me to be hosting tonight with the extraordinary J.B. McKinnon. I've read a lot of his work and keep seeing him pop up in documentary films every so often. So before we get rolling, I'm just going to give him a full-on introduction. So J.B. McKinnon is the author or co-author of 5 books of nonfiction. He's an award-winning journalist, and his work has been featured in the New Yorker, the National Geographic, the Atlantic, as well as the Best American Science and Nature Writing anthologies. He's an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of British Columbia, where he teaches feature writing. And his latest book, which is the one that we're going to be talking about tonight, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, is a thought experiment that imagines what would happen to our economies, our products, our planet, ourselves, if we committed to consuming far fewer of the Earth's resources. And it's, to be perfectly frank, when the Tyee first asked me if I wanted to host, I had kind of mixed emotions about stopping shopping, because I've always been myself a bit of a shopper, oddly enough, because I grew up in a very sort of non-shopping part of the world on the east shore of Kootenay Lake, which is not exactly, fashion central. But even as a young child, I remember, putting together outfits when at the height of the 70s, kind of disco, debauchery, putting together this entirely satin outfit, like satin jacket, satin jeans, a big floppy, let's go crazy kind of floppy hat, and walking along the highway, hoping that somebody would see me in all my, shining glory, because that stuff was so shiny you could have seen it from space, but there was no one there to kind of appreciate it on rural Route 1. So clothing in particular in fashion has always been a really big part of my life. And, as a teenager, it's critical. It's really crucial. It's your kind of form of social currency that you kind of leapfrog, from one kind of social hierarchy in high school to the next. And I remember working one summer, my entire, summer savings, blowing it all at Le Chateau in like the course of one afternoon, which I think at the time was like $800, which is a huge amount of money, in 1985 or whatever. So, yeah, and even last week when I was kind of getting ready for this event, and I was, supposed to be reading JB's book, which I was, but I was also kind of flipping back and forth and watching the Halston series on Netflix. So I felt kind of like, I had JB McKinnon on one shoulder, the angelic JB McKinnon, and, the sort of devil Halston on this shoulder. So to say I am conflicted is putting it mildly. And, it took me actually a couple of kind of goes at JB's book, because at first I kind of read it with a bit of a defensive posture, because I I can't tell you how many times I've sort of said to myself, okay, you're going to stop buying clothes. You're going to, you're going to create a capsule wardrobe. You're going to, cut down on all your consumption. And then, my sister would say, do you want to go to the Bay? And I'd be like, yeah, let's go to the Bay. So it's kind of an ongoing struggle in my own mind. And so, I think maybe we can work some stuff out tonight in our conversation. But before we get rolling, I just wanted to do one final bit of housekeeping, which is to give a shout out to the Tyee builders. For all you Tyee fans, you probably know that we launched a campaign about a week and a half ago or so to actually add 500 new contributors daily, or builders, Tyee builders. And we hit 500 today. So, and we're still like 11 days into the campaign, or 11 days to go rather in the campaign. So there's lots of time for other folk to kind of join the party. But also just to take a moment to express how, truly grateful and thankful we are to those folks who are supporting independent journalism in Canada. It means a huge deal. It means that, Tyee journalists are out there asking the tough questions, the hard questions. And it also allows us to do events like tonight. And it's, I'm always really struck by, the sort of depth of, not loyalty exactly, but, the depth of feeling that people have about the Tyee when you're out on the street or you're at a dinner party and you're talking, to people and you say, oh, I work at the Tyee, and they're like, oh, the Tyee, which is just really, really heartening. So, from the depths of my heart, thank you so much. And without further ado, I'm going to invite the lovely JB McKinnon to join me, and we'll get this show on the road. There he is in all his glory.
We've had in all his glory, lovely, angelic.
He's so
I don't think I've ever been so oversold in my life. But yeah, thank you, Dorothy, for that introduction, and thank you to the Tyee and Upstart and Crow and the Tyee builders, of course, as you mentioned. Among the places I have written for is the Tyee, and
yes.
In fact, that's where Elisa Smith's and my book, The 100-Mile Diet, was effectively launched as when it switched from being a project in our home to a published idea that people paid attention to. That took place on the Tyee. So yeah, also wonderful to see so many people here. I had earlier today, I heard through the grapevine that there was the editor of I guess we'd just say a fairly significant media outlet who had decided that media outlet was not going to cover my book in any way, because they had decided that right now what the public mood is all about is going shopping. And so it's good. It's good to see that there is, in fact, as I very much suspected there was, there's a countercurrent running through the culture at the moment, and a lot of us, I think, are going to feel something between disquiet and despair as the consumption machine gets revved up and going again.
Yeah, you can feel the engine start to kind of kick into gear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting because your book is really, you kind of circumnavigate the globe a few times. So it takes a very sort of broad, encompassing perspective. You're traveling from the Kalahari Desert to, the coast of Japan and Ecuador and Finland. But I wanted to kind of start maybe in a much more intimate and kind of personal place, which is where I'm at, because that sort of battle that you're fighting is often an internal one. And you state it outright, like, we have to stop shopping. We can't stop shopping. And that's a kind of ongoing conflict, it's kind of inside my brain on a, weekly, daily basis. So I guess the sort of $1 trillion question is like, why are we so compelled to do this activity, this thing we call shopping?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I came to feel much more strongly than I did in the past as I was working on this book was, I just became a lot more forgiving of the fact that we consume, that all of us do it. It's a consumer society. We live in a consumer economy, It's the operating system for our social and economic systems. And I mean, what's really remarkable is that we're so consistently uncomfortable with it, and that we so consistently feel like, hey, why are we doing this? I mean, of course we're doing it. There's tremendously powerful forces that are urging us to do it. If you look at what's happening right now, government stimulus is encouraging low interest rates, government stimulus, price drops in sales and things like that from the business community. The voices of many major politicians and business leaders are urging us towards a consumer-driven recovery. The $600 billion advertising industry is cranking itself back up to full steam. I mean, it's almost remarkable that we've retained the ability to question the fact, because the external forces are so powerful, compelling us to do this. And I mean, to me, that's quite hopeful, is that so many of us do still have this internal struggle with how we consume.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny to me because, we kind of framed the book as a thought experiment, but the pandemic made it quite real in many ways. And and I kind of feel like, the pandemic is almost this sort of little microcosm of what the book is, because, we started out on this quite, we're on this collectively together. And, there was people baking bread, and there was all this sort of time spent, in reflection and, like you say, non-commercial time. But then there was a bit of a turn when, people started to get tired, and they started to get bored, and they started to not want to wear the same pair of sweatpants day in and day out. And the thing that always strikes me about, even in the context of reading your book, is how contrary humans can be. Like, you tell them to do one thing and they will do another, which is, what the pandemic is really kind of actively demonstrating with, anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers. And you kind of think, oh, for, Christ's sake, like, what does it take to get humans kind of collectively together to do things for the sake not only of ourselves, but for, the betterment of the planet, which again is, I guess, another kind of large question, but I don't know, JP. Do you have an answer to that one?
Wow, I'm really going to have to reach for that angelic inspiration. I mean, maybe I'll just rewind to how it played out for me. I mean, it was really interesting, obviously, because I had actually almost finished writing the book. In fact, I had effectively finished writing it, and then all of a sudden the pandemic broke out, and it took me actually a little while to realize that it was becoming the experiment that I had played out in my head, and on that it played out in conversations with people around the world. When I realized that, then I started to really, really pay attention and noticed that it was a great opportunity to kind of test drive the ideas that had been part of a thought experiment against reality. And I mean, it was really striking. It was for example, one of the hanging questions up to that point had been, well, if people are cut off, if we turn consumer culture off, then how quickly do people turn from more materialist, consumerist type values towards more intrinsic values like community, connection with people we care about, connection with the natural world, expertise in the things we do. How quickly would we make that change? And, the people I was talking to who were leading thinkers about the psychology of materialism said, well, actually, we just don't really know. It happened so quickly, as we all saw, right? We went from shopping, for recreation to baking sourdough loaves, practically almost literally overnight. We saw the switch. I mean, I still remember, I can't quite remember which billionaire it was, but, billionaire who was posting images on Instagram of himself quarantining on his yacht in the Caribbean, and was kind of like shouted off of social media, right?
Yeah.
The exact kind of images that a week earlier were the bread and butter of Instagram. And yet values changed that quickly, right? So what had been totally normal and acceptable became abhorrent, extraordinarily quick. So those are the sorts of observations that I was making. But then, as you say, the tenor of things changed. And I think they changed for a number of reasons. One is that a pandemic is not ultimately the day the world stops shopping. It wasn't really the thought experiment, because one of the things that you would expect to happen in a turn away from consumer culture is a strong turn towards connection with, connection with human beings. And we had the opposite in the pandemic. So a lot of the ways that lower consuming societies and that people who practice lower consuming lifestyles find satisfaction and fulfillment is in the strength and richness of their connections to people they care about, their communities, and often the natural world. And we were cut off for the most part from all three. So that was part of it. I think the other thing that it really taught, and which was predicted by by the psychologist I was talking to, is that we're not very good at, most of us are not very good at being deconsumers or non-consumers, or, we're very practiced. We're born into consumer society. We're very good at it, and we know how to draw meaning from it. And it turns out we're not that skilled at the other way of living. So it just, points in so many interesting directions in terms of, if we want to get towards that, what does that mean? Does it mean we have to develop the skills to be more human? It probably does.
And you make that point, I think, in a couple of different chapters where, with the sort of Finnish Great Depression and when the Soviet Union fell, that people kind of looked back on those periods of time, even though they were periods of quite severe struggle, with a degree of warmth and nostalgia, because the sort of, big crisis kind of took away from the daily crisis of trying to sort of, keep up with the Joneses or maintain your status or have the right pair of jeans or what have you, right? There was this sort of moment of stepping away from all of that. And now I feel like we're kind of coming back to it again. And there's that sense of ramping up, which is, very anxiety producing in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the things that I heard most from people about was the feeling of release from, what's sometimes called positional consumption, right? The consumption we do that isn't necessarily trying to bump us to the top of the status hierarchy, but it's we're constantly trying to maintain position and status and interpretation and identity in a whole bunch of different ways, because consumer culture has become so complex. So, we're sending signals to subcultures that we care about, to our friends, to our peers, our colleagues at work, people on the internet that we've never met before. I mean, we're doing a lot of signaling, and we're good at it.
But then you do an interesting thing where you bookend the book with, time spent in the Kalahari Desert with the indigenous folk who live there. And you make the point that for large sections of human history that, little growth or no growth at all was kind of, the way it was. And this is a relatively recent kind of aberration away from that. We've kind of stepped outside of history, and now we have to kind of step back into what was sort of a more normal or, kind of beneficial way of being, not just with, other people, but with the planet itself. So in kind of reimagining that, or taking that step back to where we once might have been, it seems to require such a systemic approach. You can make all the individual choices that you want about, not shopping, but unless there are larger things that happen at the same time, kind of on a society-wide level, how effective do you think stopping shopping is going to be?
Yeah, I think that's maybe the biggest point that I drew from the research I did for the book, which is that, I mean, it really shouldn't be about the individual making the choice to stop shopping. It's difficult to do in the context of a consumer society. The people who try often can't stick with it. Probably not because they, well, in many cases, not because they feel it's dissatisfying, but because they feel it's isolating, and they feel like oddballs at the fringes of society. Some people are satisfied with that. Some people like to be mavericks. Some people live at the fringes of society, and are, that's where they want to be. But a lot of people don't, and those people, find it very difficult. A lot of people find it very difficult to practice voluntary simplicity in the middle of a consumer culture. We've seen historically that we have these moments where there's much greater openness to the idea of a lower consuming society. And I mean, to my surprise, actually, I mean, we've seen decluttering trends multiple times through history, all of it. And yet it always ends with a surge back towards consumption. So the historian David Shee, whose work I looked at around that, his conclusion was that, well, this simplicity thing, it's never going to be any. And I draw a different conclusion, which is that that's, maybe what it indicates is that calling on the consumer to make the kinds of changes that we need in order to end up with a lower consuming society is maybe just not the right path. And that we need to look, as you said, at the system itself and the kinds of changes we can make within the system. That became the recurrent theme that rose up out of all of these case studies and conversations that I had that make up the book.
Well, you make the point too, I think, really clearly that, it's not the people who are living a relatively modest lifestyle. It's actually people who are far wealthier that are the problem. Like, when you're spending time with the family in Ecuador and they're having a perfectly fine life, but they are not consuming at a sort of more than one planet scale, as you say. And I was kind of think, how do you get the people who are really the larger source of the problem, if you want to call them, the people on the yachts, or the, people who are extremely wealthy and kind of, perhaps taking more than their fair share, like 5 times over. Like, how do you get those people on board with this particular idea? Or do you?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that it really isn't only the people on the yachts, right? We have inequality in countries like Canada. And of course we do have people who could have all the yachts they want here in Canada. But globally, there's also this division, right? There are entire nations that are effectively yachts. And so in terms of consumption, those are the most powerful drivers of consumption, quite plainly. It's, half the world is, on the day that the world stops shopping, probably half the world population wouldn't need to stop. They're consuming at a level that would be environmentally sustainable. There's a lot of those people who need to consume more in order to meet basic needs. And then there is, even in the upper half, there's very clearly a gradient in terms of who holds responsibility here. I mean, if you look in the United States, for example, about 50% of people rarely or never fly in an airplane. And of course, most of us probably know people who fly in airplanes monthly, maybe more often than that, certainly multiple times in a year. That's just not uncommon in a place like Canada. And yet in Canada as well, I'm sure that there's a substantial number of people who never travel by plane, who do it so very frequently because they don't have the cash. So consumption is, this is one of those examples where we can see how system change, can really affect things, because we know how to address inequality. We know that there are tools to do that. We can place high taxes on the wealthy. There are all kinds of distributive mechanisms that we can draw on. We also know that inequality accelerates consumption. So in countries with a great deal of inequality, there is a higher pressure to consume because of that positional quality that consumption has in society. So in each of these things, I started to realize, you don't go to the people on the yachts and say, you need to, you ought to. What would be morally right for you to do is buy fewer yachts. I think we have the tools to address inequality, and in one fell swoop, we reduce consumption at the highest end, and we distribute wealth more fairly, so that we end up with a society in which people feel less driven to consume.
Well, and part of that ties into, one of the things that you talk about non-commercial time, where if you give people the benefit of free time, essentially time to really think in a much more kind of in deep and engaged fashion, which is kind of what the pandemic did for a while. And, you draw a sort of through line between, something like the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer, because people actually they had time, right? They had time to kind of more deeply engage with issues and ideas and, protest and social change and all of that great stuff. And shopping, I guess, in some ways has been a bit of almost an aesthetic, maybe, to like what's going on in the sort of broader cultural realm. And, it kind of distracts people, and it takes up so much time and so much energy and so much thought and so much money, that it's kind of drawn people away from maybe these sort of larger things that we need to deal with, in terms of climate change and, social inequality. So that sense of time itself being a bit of a resource that we got back if we stopped shopping, which to me was one of the moments of revelation when I was reading your book, because I thought, oh yeah, of course, if you're not shopping, you have time to do, more socially engaged stuff, which is a great benefit to, the world.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by it as well, actually. That was one of the things I hadn't really thought about was that it is something of a zero-sum game. I mean, we if we're spending all of our time earning and spending, and a lot of our time thinking about, well, how am I going to earn and what am I going to spend on, and we do a lot of that. I mean, even those of us who probably think of ourselves as not terribly materialist, I mean, I think we spend more time than we would guess thinking about the material aspects of life. And of course, just plain working and just plain consuming takes up a lot of time. You notice this particularly in people who practice voluntary simplicity, particularly the form that used to be called downshifting, right? Where people were not only consuming less, but actually actively trying or accepting the idea that they would work less, earn less. They get a lot of time out of that. And it's that time that allows people to invest in something different. So they invest more energy in building strong relationships with people they care about. But another of those, as you mentioned, is those people tend to invest more of their time in issues larger than themselves. And I mean, I feel this myself, I think. And now that I'm aware of it, if I get busy, I'm going to pay less attention to issues. I'm going to pay less attention to hey, well, what kind of response am I personally going to give to this issue that's playing out in the world? If I'm busy on a book tour, I'm not going to do that. And it's unfortunate, right? It is that kind of best self feeling where you're like, I'm not my best self here. I don't, I'm concerned with myself and the things that I need and what's going on in my world. And I'm not reaching out. I'm not extending my compassion and empathy to the world around me. I think that's probably a familiar feeling to a lot of us. And yes, that's what you get back. that's what you get back in a system that is less centered on consumption and materialism.
Mhm. Well, and the ramifications too, I think, on the non-human world are significant. And there was that whole kind of chapter during the pandemic when it's like, the whales are returning and the sky is brightening, and the natural world was kind of like in resurgence. And you dedicate a whole chapter to finally we can save the whales. And I had no idea like that amount of traffic, in terms of shipping lanes being kind of like a 6-lane highway in the ocean, were so incredibly detrimental to the health and well-being of whales. Like we're not harpooning them, but we're subjecting them to a slow death by noise, which was in some ways more horrifying than sort of Moby Dick scenario. Like and I didn't know that. Like that was, I knew a little bit about it, but not quite to that degree. So again, that was another genuine surprise that came out of the book. And I guess I'm curious about that chapter, how you kind of came to discover that.
Yeah, I came to discover that really through just environmental writing that I've been doing over the last few years. And it was part of the origin story of this book as well, was just realizing that whatever subject I dipped into as an environmental writer, it just led back to consumption. And I think at that point, I didn't really realize that that consumption was now considered to be the leading cause of, or the leading cause of environmental crises across the board, really, from deforestation to climate change to species extinction. I think if somebody had asked me, 10 years ago, certainly, even probably 5 years ago, I think I might still have thought population as, that kind of been the hip number one cause since the 1960s.
Yeah.
But it changed sometime around the turn of the millennium. And now how much we consume matters more than how many of us there are. It's having a greater impact than the raw number of people. So that's kind of where that came from. And then, but the whales thing, yeah, that really struck me. The realization that you have populations of not just whales, but other animals that have been conserved, have been saved from raw slaughter through hunting, only to, find themselves fading away due to the construction of resorts on the world's beaches, or noise and shipping. The trade, the trade in wildlife as pets, the trade in wildlife as medicine, but increasingly not, in the book, I talk about the fact that there's been this shift, as they say, from health to wealth. So it's no longer this issue of people killing wild animals in order to create medicines for, conditions, serious medical conditions. It's more that same wildlife being slaughtered so that it can be turned into a hangover cure, for people who have overconsumed, or to be fed to tourists in a tropical restaurant, these sorts of things. So it comes up in so many surprising ways.
Yeah, the one that kind of really struck me was in Hawaii, where people are diving and they want to take pictures of fish, and the fish are like, so, people were not in the picture, or there was just one solitary human being. There was that resurgence back, and that that in itself is a little bit heartening, because you think at least that resilience is still there to a certain degree. And once humans are out of the picture, that there is this kind of like moving into the place that humans previously occupied, and that the natural world can kind of come back to where it was.
Yeah, I realized that. The previous book, The Once and Future World, I wrote in there this realization I had that nature isn't gone, it's waiting.
Yeah.
And you really saw that in the pandemic. people vanished. A lot of it was really the vanishing of the tourist trade, which of course is a powerful form of consumption. And yeah, those people, people vanished from beaches and landscapes around the world. And again, almost overnight, the reports started coming in of other species sensing the absence and starting to dip a toe in those new spaces. It really, and as you said, with the blue skies and the abrupt drop in carbon emissions, it shows the power of actually just slowing down the consumer machine. And if that's the case, I mean, if we can see the raw power of it, then how is it that we continue to keep it off the table of discussion in terms of how we will address these environmental problems, right? I mean, we're still completely centered on either on ignoring the issue or on solving it through technology. And yet here we see that we can, we just turn the dial down a notch, and instantly you see betterment in all kinds of environmental measures. You turn the dial down a few more notches, and the effects are almost extraordinary.
I guess that's why it's particularly horrifying when you think about it kind of ramping back up to where it was, or maybe even exceeding where it was. And I was thinking about particularly the sort of younger generation, because they seem to be subjected much more strenuously to those forces than maybe people who are a bit older. And my son is 20 at the moment, and there's no way the idea of stopping shopping has even occurred to him. And they are like, that younger culture is so immersed in that world. And you think about something like unboxing videos or haul videos, which were this sort of huge phenomenon on social media, which, for anyone who doesn't know, basically you go and buy stuff and then you film yourself kind of opening it, or you go to a store and you buy as much as you possibly can, and then you film yourself kind of going through all of the things that you bought. So, and I you talk a little bit about the sort of next generation coming up, but I'm curious, I guess, like what that means to the kids who are so deeply immersed in shopping culture at the moment, and how you kind of say there's a different world, right? There's another world, because they've lived online their entire lives. Like they're so Instagram, social media heavy, and so driven by those forms like that, like you say, are another form of kind of positional consumption in a very, very overt fashion. Yeah. So how do you fight that particular monster? Because it's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, this is it's handy in a book to be able to turn consumption off instantly as a thought experiment.
In the real world,
I don't think it's going to work that way.
Yeah.
In the real world. We're talking about we're talking about something that needs to build into a movement that that incites change in every corner of consumer culture. But there are a couple of specific things, like maybe I can say that are more useful. Well, one thing is, I want to point out that there are a lot of young people who are responding to this overwhelming the deluge of marketing and targeting that they are the recipients of. They're out there on the blockade at Fairy Creek. They're organizing and leading the largest climate action campaigns and marches that we've seen. There's a lot of promise in the generation that's coming up right now, I think. On the other hand, there are also ways into this. And one thing, I mean, I talk a bit about the company Levi's, which was in the book, which was, as a large global corporation, good enough to actually talk to me about consumption and to think aloud with me about it about what would happen if it stopped. And the conclusion that they came to in the pandemic that maybe they should be actually looking at trying to sell less, fewer actual items, per customer, rather than following the model of faster and faster and faster fashion. Levi's knows how to talk to, young people are its market. And if they see this possibility of saying, hey, rather than endlessly buying more things, maybe buy some wonderful things that you love and keep them and live in them and have them change with you. In a sense, there's this alternative, which is to become, oddly enough, more materialistic, right? To become more engaged with the products that you own rather than detached from them, in order to end up in a place where you are consuming fewer but better things, services, and experiences.
Yeah, but does that become another form of creating status? Like, I know you talked to the Patagonia folk as well, and they had this kind of anti-consumer campaign that they launched on Black Friday, saying, don't buy this jacket. And of course, everyone was like, well, buy that jacket. And it had the opposite effect, right? Like that became the idea that you could buy something that was sustainably made, but much more expensive, became another form of like creating status. And again, some people can do that or afford it, and some people really can't. So it's, it might look on the surface like it's a good thing, but it's problematic maybe in other ways that are a little less overt.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's where we're at right now with this idea of buy less, buy better. For one thing, I think it's more likely that there's going to be buy more, buy better.
Yeah.
There will be people who will buy the same number of things, or more or less the same number, certainly an unsustainable number of things, but they will buy them in better quality. That's the kind of tendency that you'd expect to arise out of consumer culture as it is now. And of course, you are going to see it used in positional ways. But nonetheless, even a system where people were buying less but better across a spectrum, where some people were buying less but not quite as good as other people who were buying less but very good. It wouldn't be worse in terms of positional consumption than things are today, and it would consume a lot fewer resources. So that alone would be an advance. But I agree with you that there's more to the picture than that, and that jumps back to these questions of, well, if inequality is an actual driver of the consumer impulse, then that's another thing we need to address within it.
But at the same time, there's a couple of examples in the book, and I'm thinking about Sado Island, which is off the coast of Japan. And you talk about it not as a system, but as a kind of possible development, like, it's kind of a ways ahead of where we might be. And it's much, a much more kind of quieter, more solitary, maybe, more kind of almost occasionally desolate way of life, but it's much more sustainable. And there's that kind of move back to this kind of quieter way of being. And oddly enough, it made me think of the Kootenays. And I thought, on Sunday, when, everything was closed and you couldn't go anywhere or do anything, and, you were bored out of your tree as a little child and wanting to be anywhere but there. But at the same time, as an older person, you look at that now and you think, oh, that looks good. But as a younger person, you're like, kill me now, like, out of my mind. So
yeah, I think also, though, those memories are grounded in the fact that you had a perception that there was something,
better
somewhere else. There was something better and tremendously
exciting. I was right
exciting.
about that.
It could be. But yeah, Sado Island, again, it's like, it's not a perfect comparison, because Sado Island has undergone depopulation. It stands in for a decline in consumption because it has had a decline in consumption, but that decline in consumption has come from the absence
Believing,
of human beings. Yeah. So again, I mean, it is something of a lonely and desolate place. What I think is most interesting about Sado is just the realization that, a place can effectively degrow by 50%. It doesn't, it doesn't roll back to Neanderthal times, right? It's just a smaller economy that operates according to somewhat different principles. People reorganize themselves in different ways. People have to make a bit more of their own amusement. They work less. They have more time. They spend time, doing the things that they find satisfying. It's attracting people. It's attracting young Japanese people who are sick of living in Tokyo and Osaka and want to get outside of that machine. But I think most importantly, it's the big lesson to be drawn from places like Sado is we don't have to fear outright this idea that the economy may slow down or that the economy may shrink. It genuinely is not the end of the world.
Yeah.
And Sado has never, Japan has not grown for about 30 years. I mean, it's had periods of growth and periods of declining growth. And, but overall, over about 30 years, it has had very little economic growth. What it hasn't done is actually restructured itself for that reality. So we still don't really know what a functioning, engaged, lower consuming, degrown kind of society might look like. We don't really have, there's nowhere to look in the world and say, we see how it's working. So we have to go looking for hints and glimpses.
Well, and I think that sort of brings me to my final question before we kind of open it up to the Tyee audience, is that in chapter 14, you talk about, if we're not consumers, what are we? And then you quote, I think, from Lawrence of Arabia, talking about, this failure to step into the sort of new world, that the sort of old world will kind of, surge back and establish itself once more. And, we'll just kind of go back to, whatever was normal. And of course, whatever was normal was really, really not functional and not working. So, at this particular moment in time, and, very much in this moment in time, because we are just talking, in BC about kind of restarting, reopening, kind of going back to, where we were before. So before that happens, like, is there a moment that we should pause and think, do we really want to go back there? Do we really want to go back to that place of, like, busyness for its own sake and consumption for its own sake and all of those things that are, so kind of corrosive, I think, to, and soul deadening in many ways, which I think is, a lot of the people who go to Sado Island say, I felt like I needed to kind of like reimagine myself and, what it looked like to live in this particular world that we're in. So again, that's kind of it's a big question, but I think it's also the one probably that's really uppermost in a lot of people's minds is like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We are at this point where we're a little bit eager to get back to consumer culture, and we're a little bit uneasy about it. I think we really have kind of forgotten what it feels like to be totally immersed. I think that I can't realistically picture, here in Vancouver, I think I've actually forgotten really what full-blown rush hour looks like, what that traffic looks like, what the air looks like because of the traffic, what the bombardment of advertising, like advertising spending digitally and in real life dropped dramatically during the pandemic. It's going to crank back up, and it is cranking back up. And so we're going to feel that bombardment again. I think it's going to feel sickening to a lot of us. Just feeling that rise, there's been all these people celebrating the lack of pressure around how they have to present themselves every day and the time that they have to invest in that. When we return to that, I think people are going to wonder about that as a trade-off. We're going to have a confrontation with what it means to be a consumer in 21st century consumer society. Now, what do I hope comes out of that? I'm not optimistic enough to think that we're not going to go back to normal. I think for the most part, we are going to go back to normal. What I hope is that a really powerful and enduring conversation comes out of it. That we're able to maintain the kind of conversation that we're having tonight, and that clearly, is of interest to a lot of people who showed up here. So that's what I'm hoping, is that we can, and much of the hope that I have placed in this book is that it will contribute to starting a conversation that starts to bring consumption itself back to the center of the conversation around how we're going to move towards a more sustainable society.
I sure as hell hope so. And part of that conversation we had on the Tyee this past week about what people were, willing to give up, like what they would, buy again or what they wouldn't buy again. And some of them were, fairly practical and, straightforward. And other ones were like, huh, I had no idea. And even I think you talk in the book a little bit about, RV sales crashing during the Great Recession, but then they've been cranking up pandemic. So there was kind of the opposite effect. So there's all those kind of weird, kind of oddities kind of happening in different times in history.
Yeah.
But a lot of the folk at the Tyee, were sort of mentioning, well, I want to buy new underwear, but, I'm not going to buy like a car or, I'm going to buy clothes, but I'll buy them secondhand. And, all of those are great solutions, and a lot of them are, easily doable. But again, it's like all that kind of individual choice has some benefit, but, we still need to kind of tackle the larger issues collectively.
Yeah, and I mean, I think things like the Tyee poll, I mean, it's an opportunity to think about these things much more, I hope, than than a sense of how can I discipline myself next to lower the pressure I personally put on the planet. I think what hopefully comes out of our thinking around those sorts of things is, what do we want to hang on to from the pandemic? Well, there were some things of value that we learned, at least at times during the pandemic. So what of those do we want to hang on to and maintain going forward? What did we not miss in the slightest about consuming? What aspects of consumer culture can we completely live without the slightest discomfort? We probably almost all have some of those things, right? What are some of the things that we felt like we consumed far too much of? For me, like many people, screen time, right? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that I do not need to be doing on the screen, and I look forward to finding ways to spend my time differently. And I think maybe more important than hey, what do I take away from myself is what do I give myself, right? I think from talking to people who practice voluntary simplicity, a lot of them said that, in the periods of time, for example, in the 90s, when a lot of people were doing this, the people who were least likely to stick with it over the long term were people who strictly saw it as like, I can live without this, I can live without that, and I can live without this other thing. And the people who endured were like, I can live without those things because I'm going to put my energy into volunteering, or I'm going to put my energy into taking care of my children and my parents. fostering my relationships with my friends, spending more time in nature, things like that. They gave themselves things rather than simply, giving it up.
Scourged themselves.
Yeah.
Well, and people are hardwired for pleasure, right? And to
Yeah.
avoid suffering if they can. So it's like going on a diet. You can do it for a while. Or I think someone on the Tyee poll said, it's like abstinence only. You can, when it comes to go without it for a while, but you can't go without, stuff forever. So
yeah, and we don't have to, right? I mean,
yeah,
we don't have to go without. I think this is another of these things where we tend to think, it's an on-off switch. And I suppose a book like The Day the World Stops Shopping might encourage that. But no, for me, it's a thought experiment that helps us, helps reveal truths that we might not otherwise uncover. But we don't have to go from buying too much to buying nothing, right?
Yeah, wearing a hair shirt.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that we can't use fashion
Wove ourselves.
Yeah, I mean,
from our own hair.
What I hear a lot now are, people saying, well, how do I express my identity without consumption? Well, no one's asking you to give up all consumption. And if we look through history, I mean, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, North American culture was radically less consumptive than it is today. Did people have trouble expressing their identities? And of course not. Some of the most iconic individuals in our cultural base are people from that era, right? They were powerfully able to express their identities with radically less consumption than we're doing today.
I'm looking at all the questions.
Oof.
There's a lot. Oh my. Oh dear. All right.
Better pour some more water.
Hi. Michael Schmidt asks, is this about consumption or production? Maybe we need to focus on policies that lead us to make less stuff. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, the two are obviously connected. We don't, but I think, the clearest example of that is that, how do we move towards an economy where the stuff that we do acquire is in this fewer, better things kind of model? How do we do it? Not just by asking people to buy fewer, better things, but by, for example, changing tax regimes so that it's less costly to repair a product or maintain it than to throw it out and buy a new one. Mandating, to begin with, mandating that products be made in a way that they are repairable or upgradable without having to dispose, of the whole thing again. Lifespan labeling on particularly on sort of durable physical goods. These are all ideas that are already in play, more so in Europe than here, but are certainly being discussed here.
Yeah, I think France just outlawed planned obsolescence. In its entirety, which is, a step forward.
Yeah, exactly. You can outlaw planned obsolescence. That's one way. Yeah, I think France did that in 2015, I think it was, but they've had very few cases. So I think that law is maybe not as sweeping as one might imagine, but it is, that's the idea. And then of course, we can look at sort of bigger picture things like true cost pricing, where, the price of the social and environmental consequences of a product are built into the price of that product. And that starts to shift the footing as well. For example, from non-organic cotton, it makes organic cotton more competitive. It makes long staple cotton, which is used to make more durable cotton products, more competitive. So there's all those sorts of steps that can be taken.
Yeah, I'm ready. Chris asks, is it possible to transition to a more circular economy where waste can be minimized, or is it an aspirational goal forever?
No, I think it definitely is possible. The trick with things like the circular economy is that you still ultimately cannot constantly grow the economy. Because if you grow a circular system, the circle gets bigger and it needs more inputs. But there, nonetheless, I mean, looking at circularity is still really important, because it does mean, for example, that if we can take every t-shirt that we make today and when it's time to retire it, it gets turned into a new t-shirt. I mean, that's a good big step forward. The bad news is the organizations that's tracking circularity says that the percentage of the global economy that's circular was actually declining at the start of the pandemic.
Interesting. Heather asks, how much less do we actually need to consume to make a difference to the planet?
1% less. I mean, 0.1% less.
Yeah, because it's actually quite remarkably not that huge to make a demonstrable difference.
To make a demonstrable difference, yeah, any amount almost. I mean, it would be significant immediately. For example, we have yet to, through green technology, to achieve a single year's absolute reduction in carbon emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions. When we turn the dial down on consumption, that happens immediately. So, we could achieve overnight through a reduction in consumption what we failed to achieve in about 20 years of, hard effort through politics and green technology. So, yeah, reduction works, and it works rapidly if we can navigate the wheres and hows of how to do it.
Are we? Oh, Courtney. I guess the question I have is, when clothing retailers have sales, I get lured into thinking that's a good deal. How do you resist that urge? I want to know the answer to this one as well.
I mean, there are tried and true ways, I suppose. The main one is take some time away. Don't, it's kind of the count to 10 method before you start swearing, right? It's you just take some time away from it, and most of the time people find that they conclude that they don't, well, I don't necessarily need that, particularly if you're cognizant of these other issues around the consequences of consumption. That said, I want to emphasize that I'm hoping that people will not come away from tonight's event thinking that it's all about them reducing their consumption and feeling crappy about it every time they do consume. As I said, we're all in this system. It's no surprise that we feel the drive and desire to do this. It's important that we talk about it. It's important that we start to think about how we can contribute to changing that at a systemic level. I don't think we get a lot of energy to do that from beating ourselves up about it.
Well, and I think even during the pandemic, when there was that kind of, surge in online shopping, and it, that one is a particularly insidious one because it gives you a couple of hits of endorphins, right? You get that kind of initial wah, when you get to buy something, and then when it shows up at your door, you get the other I get to open it now and see what you actually bought. And I know people who are have a very, very hard time with online shopping because it's just so damn easy to go click.
Yeah.
And Amazon made gazillions of dollars over the past year and a bit, so that hasn't kind of slowed one iota in terms of people.
No, and I haven't actually seen. I mean, I think there are proposals around how we can kind of slow down slow down advertising and marketing on online. I mean, certainly there are steps that can be taken around the targeting of advertising, and there are apps and so on that you can use to reduce the number of ads. But of course, there's lots of friction that's thrown up against those things as well. I mean, I try to avoid advertising online, but it often means that I have to come onto a site and it says you can't read this because you haven't allowed ads, and they're fighting back, right?
Yeah.
So, but I do think if we can find ways to just step back for a moment, maybe one way to think about it is when you see the ad, it's trying to hit you with that expectation of thrill, but you can also picture that moment when you get the actual thing, open it up, and 10 minutes later, it's not that amazing, right? Most of us have either buyer's remorse or at least a gentle letdown from what we buy. So,
But like you say, it is persistent, right? Like if you look at a pair of
Persistent.
jeans, like they will follow you around the internet going, have you weakened yet? Like buy me now, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So that kind of, ability for online shopping to kind of, pester you,
Yeah. Well, I
you
mean,
kind of break down.
supporting more models online that aren't driven by advertising is certainly
Wow, here we are at the Tyee.
here we are. Look where we are here at the Tyee. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important part of it, right? Is that if we may have to adapt to the idea that fewer better can apply to our information sources, and the use we make of the digital world as well, and we can decide to commit some resources to the handful of places that we want to get our information from, and spend less time in those odd corners where we're getting bombarded.
Yeah. Paloma asks, what impact has your research on consumption had on your own life and consumption, if any?
Well, in my case, it had the ironic effect of causing
You
me to
bought
buy more things.
Yeah.
So
More better things.
more better things. Yeah. No, actually, it did. For me, it was clarifying in terms of how I wanted to consume, and it liberated me somewhat from the sense that I had to, torture myself over everything that I might buy. So, in the end, I was able to go ahead and buy some things that I thought I needed, and they, because of that, I found those purchases satisfying. They weren't an enormous number of them, but I did buy some things.
Yeah.
I bought this shirt, for example, which is from a company that's mentioned in the book. But
the $195 shirt.
That's right.
Looking good.
Yeah, I've got the math there in the book. If I can afford the upfront cost, and this thing lasts as long as they say it,
yeah, like 25
it's cheaper than Walmart.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an experiment in whether how this buy less, buy better thing really works. But I think the other main thing is that it, as I mentioned earlier, it made me a lot less judgmental about my own consumption and about other people's consumption. I've really noticed that we tend to, even the best intentioned of us, I think, tend to have forms of consumption that we disdain and blind spots around other types of consumption. And often it's divided around things like class and culture. Really, we're all in it, and it really comes down to what we spend. I mean, the clearest determinant of whether we're high consuming or low consuming is how much money we're spending. If we're spending more in a year than we did last year, we're probably having a higher impact. If we're spending less, probably having a lower impact. And of course, this is why the world's wealthiest people and nations are the primary drivers of consumption as a problem, and people who earn less worldwide are not.
Okay, there's a debate happening in the YouTube comments about dollar stores. On one hand, they provide affordable goods, albeit bad quality, for folks who cannot afford more expensive goods. And on the other hand, they're incredibly wasteful and support wasteful consumption. What do you think?
Again, I think I would probably just go to the easy answer of where are they in the mix? I mean, there probably are some things, like it isn't just a matter of buying everything to last 400 years. There are some things that we don't necessarily want to have last for a long time, and they have an appropriate lifespan. And some of those things we might want to get at a dollar store. It's really difficult to I'm reluctant to say to fall on one side or the other around dollar stores compared to MEC or I can't even think of the names of any of the high-end department stores right now. Somebody else.
Not
these are all places where where a lot of people consume a lot of things. And the dollar store ultimately, probably because it's attracting, for the most part, people who have less to spend, I would wager that the dollar store consumer is generally going to have a lower impact than the average consumer, and may in fact be comfortably within a sustainable level of consumption, despite the fact that we've created a system where it's very difficult for them to afford higher quality goods.
Well, it's funny, I stumbled across a debate that was happening on Twitter just today, because someone was saying, if you buy something at H&M and because you can afford it, like if you buy that, like maybe, I don't know, every once a year, say, it's better actually than someone who's buying more expensive, more sustainable goods, but like one thing every week. So it's all kind of, like you say, a bit relative in terms of what you're actually spending your money on.
Yeah,
that's a good kind of way to kind of gauge your consumptive impact.
Yeah, I mean, spending is a really clear indicator. And of course, spending is complicated too, for all the reasons you just said. I mean, some people invest incredible amounts of energy and research into buying very, very low impact goods with their money, and they spend, they pay more for them, and they can draw down their impact that way. But as a guiding rule of thumb, spend more. There's a reason that the GDP tracks very closely with carbon emissions, right? They follow effectively the same trajectory at all times. One goes up when the other one goes up. So, that's the general pattern with our consumption. We spend in a consumer society. It has environmental and social impacts. But the other thing I want to point out here is that just buying expensive things, that doesn't get you there, because a lot of things are expensive that aren't very high quality, right? There you're paying for brand and image, and that's not the same as buying something that's designed to be durable, updatable, repairable, maintainable, and to sustain through fashion cycles, right? Those are two distinctly different things.
Okay, what basic unmet human need is overconsumption, attempting to fill? Jane Birkbeck is still pondering the need for systemic structural change and how to motivate the societal change in the current me-first culture.
I don't think it's anything specific. I think what consumption has tried to, or what consumption has drawn on, is it has tried to deliver a sense of satisfaction, right? We can derive deeper satisfaction. I mean, the evidence is very strong and clear and consistent that we can drive, or that we can gain deeper satisfaction from, for example, connection with nature, investing time in our human relationships. We get more out of that, deeper satisfaction from that ultimately than we do from consuming products. But the machinery of consumer society, I mean, hanging out with your friends and family does not grow the economy. So consumer society has created this alternative for us, which is endless novelty, distractions, entertainments, amusements, and it's very good at it. And I think we get something pretty close to a feeling of satisfaction from it. And if we aren't feeling satisfied, we can always reach out and get another dose. So that, I think, is what consumerism is working with, is simply trying to offer us a type of satisfaction that we will pay for, and to pull us away from the time we might invest in things that don't make anybody any money.
Yeah, I mean, one of the parts of the book that really resonated with me in a quite a profound way was when I think it's Dune Post, the village that you go back to in the Kalahari. that you have for it, where you
Demand sharing.
demand sharing. There you go. Like that, it's not even a question that if you have, a certain amount of like food or materials or whatever, that you give them away until, everyone at least has something.
Mhm.
And that deep sense of like community and people, collectively supporting each other, like we lean together,
Mhm.
is very celebratory. It's very, like you talk about that kind of festive atmosphere of people, arms over each other and people having dinner and, the kids playing and it's so attractive because it
Mhm.
kind of strikes a really deep chord in you, right? Of like,
Yeah.
but these are people who basically, are living, I think, talking about under capacity, living on kind of the razor's edge of like, of subsistence really, but
Yeah.
are genuinely joyful and, and a very kind of tight community group.
Yeah, there's a sense in that of sharing, but it's not sharing because you feel obligated to share because, to each according to their need and from each according to their, it's not that.
Mhm.
It is because in sharing, you make yourself reliant on the people around you. And I mean, that's a very alien idea to us. It was hard for me to understand, and I probably don't. But to the extent that I do, it's a powerful idea. The idea that we can share to a point where we understand that we are reliant on each other, vulnerable to each other, and that when we lose that sense of collective reliance and collective vulnerability, then we lose something very significant. And that's where you suddenly feel this yawning divide between where we are in our society and and where some other people are in theirs. And in the case of the people that I wrote about in the book, they've been at it for 150,000 years. So in terms of the durability of culture, they're winning.
But I think there was a very kind of, it was a very decisive moment for people who kind of left that culture, partook of like, consumer culture and said, nope, like this is, not a good way to live. And that, there's a kind of sense of return to maybe an older type of human, organizing principle in society.
Well, and you see that even in ours, right? I mean, the people who I spoke to who do practice voluntary simplicity, and to the extent that I do myself, I mean, part of what I realized as I worked on this book was that, to some extent, I do practice a form of voluntary simplicity.
Oh, yeah, I heard about your torture chair.
I'm sitting on it right now. But it's really, it's interesting. Like people who practice those things really feel like this space that opens up between themselves and the culture that they live in. And as I say, for some people, for many people, it feels lonely at times, but it's pretty distinctly, it's pretty clear that most of those people are not feeling dissatisfied or less happy than we are. They probably, to the extent that they've been studied and to the extent that, my anecdotal experiences of hanging out with them would indicate they're, I would suggest they're more content and they feel a little different than the rest of us do. They're better at being, kind of human. They're better at human relations. They give their time more generously. I was really struck by how, the conversations would sprawl in these interviews, and people would have, this one woman showed up, she had journaled out her thoughts to share with me when we met. And then on the other hand, I'm talking to some other people and they're like, yeah, I can book you in for a 5-minute interview on like September 27th and it's, March 10th or whatever, right? There's that real strange thing that happens. And I felt it, I checked around with some people as the pandemic wound up and I was like, are these people going back to like, are they crowding onto Netflix and so on? And they weren't, right? for the most part, when people draw themselves away from consumption and consumerism, they go further and further in that direction. And they love the quiet space in their head and, the way their thoughts are slowed down. And they don't want to fill that. If they get a little more extra time, they don't want to fill it, even with, the really great stuff of the golden age of television. It's a very interesting, it's a very interesting dynamic.
Sure. We have a bunch more questions. Eliza asked about a counterpoint to GDP, genuine progress indicator. Actually, I was going to ask you as well. Would this focus on quality of life help us?
I think it would be a start. Yeah, I do think that we should definitely not be putting as much weight into GDP as a measure of the success of a society or an economy as we do, and that we should institute other measures. The genuine progress indicator, the Happy Planet Index. There's a whole bunch of different alternatives. There isn't any single one of those that, this is not a area that I'm an expert in by any stretch, but certainly none of those indicators stood out as the replacement for GDP. More likely, we just need to go with a basket of indicators that allow us to think about the economy and society and its success in a number of different ways, so that we can gauge what we want to put a priority on and value, and what we don't.
And Bob asked something similar. Can governments help to reverse the trend through monetary policy, which doesn't necessarily encourage inflation?
We're starting to wander into territory where I don't feel very, very comfortable. I think yes. I think there's a chapter where I sit down with an economist who has modeled the Canadian.
Oh
economy,
yeah, Victor. From York University. That was really interesting.
University.
Yeah.
We sat down and turned off shopping in his model of the Canadian economy, and it was a disaster. Then we turned it down a little less, and he was able to kind of modulate the effects through different steps that governments can take, and he was able to create a functioning society with a lower level of consumption. But in terms of like the specific acts that would need to be undertaken in terms of monetary policy, Peter Victor's stuff would probably be a great place to start on that. But I personally am probably not.
Well, I like the idea of slowing down by design and not by disaster, which I think is the line that you use. The pandemic kind of brought the hammer down in a quite shocking way, right?
Yeah, what I took from that experience with Peter Victor was that it's very, very serious, right? The idea of drawing down consumption has very serious potential consequences. Yeah. So this idea that we should just we should all live more simply. I think that when we say that, we haven't been acknowledging the fact that if we all did it, then it is the end of civilization. We have to build that alternative. We can't. It isn't enough to simply say let's all live simply, because when we do, we see pretty dramatic effects in terms of job losses and shuttered businesses and collapsed economies.
You think even of post 9/11, where it was the clear and present danger of not shopping, so it was this sort of civic patriotic duty that you got out there and shopped up a storm. Mm-hmm. But even in the pandemic, where it was you balance human life versus the economy, right? And that became kind of this very, very occasionally quite dark debate of people saying, well, I'm going to step up and sacrifice myself, and anyone who's over 70 should do the same. And you think, how did we get to this particular conversation that it's worth it if we can open stores even if people die potentially?
Yeah, that's the really frightening thing, right? Is that we actually have built that system, right? We have built this system, and we always hear consumer capitalism described as resilient and adaptive, and it can respond to any situation, it can solve any problem. And then suddenly you have to close all the stores, and it's like the end of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it proved to be not at all resilient, not highly adaptive, incredibly vulnerable, right? This is the system. And this is what, the experience with Peter Victor when we just turned off shopping in the Canadian economy, and it was like an out of control collapse. And it's fascinating to know that that's the system we live in, where we can no longer make the simple choice to consume less. We can't do it. If we do, then the consequences are extreme.
Well,
but I mean, to me, that means let's build something different, or let's build something a little less vulnerable.
And even the political ramifications, right? If you you're in the chapter about fast fashion, where it's if you're going to shut down fast fashion, which ideally, that's what we want to do, but then you're throwing, Bangladeshi factory workers, who are largely women, out of their jobs, right? So there's that kind of weird obligation of how do you mitigate the sort of, horrors of fast fashion and their sort of impact on climate with actual human suffering. And, that kind of little weird balancing act that you have to do.
Yep. There's very real consequences. We need to, when we talk about, living more simply or creating a lower consuming society, it's a serious business. That's was certainly for me one of the big takeaways from the research was maybe we didn't realize when all these voices through history that were saying, hey, be a little less materialistic, don't buy so much stuff. They were also saying you have to overturn your whole society and do things in a completely different way. I don't think we've appreciated that as much as we really need to.
Well, and maybe that's the weird lesson of the pandemic, is that kind of precursor, right, to what real horrendous change looks like. And, when we have the sort of climate catastrophe on the horizon, and that's what we have to deal with, right? Because if we don't, we're doomed.
Yeah, and the pandemic also offered up some glimpses of what we might get. We might get bluer skies out of this. We might get more sharply starlit nights. We might get we might get a stable climate. We might get a resurgent natural world. We might get stronger relationships between human beings and within communities. We might get a more engaged society. We might get a more participatory society. There is a lot. There were a lot of things that we glimpsed in the pandemic that also turn up in the other case studies that I look at in the book that point, I think, in very hopeful directions.
I think that's a really good place to stop with those parts of hope that we can kind of hang on to. So I think we're at time. So I want to thank you, JB, for writing so beautifully. I've read the book actually a couple of times now, and every time I kind of get something out of it. So, in a very kind of profound, almost spiritual fashion. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone at the Tyee who's made this event possible. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and gave us such great questions. So I'm going to let everybody go to bed since it's almost 8:30. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for turning up and for these great questions. And yeah, may the conversation continue.
Buy this book. If it's your last purchase, buy this book. Okay. I'll see you soon.